The people who have inflicted the destruction of Gaza for the last 2 years are like, we just can't watch these innocent people die in Syria. That's what motivated them. I mean, come on. They want to occupy more of Syria too. That's always been part of the greater Israel project.
So Dave Smith had a podcast recently about the catastrophe unfolding in Syria, why that's transpiring, why Israel attacked Syria, and spoiler, it's not the reasons they're telling you, and why U.S. meddling in Syria was a horrible backward policy. Let's get Dave's take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Let's get into a little bit some stuff with Syria, because this has been in the news lately and has been. But I know I was talking about this with you this weekend, Rob, but it has been kind of weird and surreal to see that essentially many of the Israel defenders on social media seem to be somehow taking this as like a big win, that things are going so bad in Israel and that Israel had to bomb Syria on behalf of the Druze or something like that. And, you know, since I guess this year, it really happened since I did that debate with Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan, but I've got the, what people call the Ziobots are out for me on Twitter. Now, I don't know if these are actually bots or not, or a mix of real people and bots. I'm not exactly sure. I certainly know there are some people who are real people who are like, have become reply guys to me on Twitter, always whatever. Anytime I post, there's a bunch of Zio people in the comments saying, no, Dave sucks or whatever.
Can attest that my comment section too is full of replies, and not only replies, but that are actually orchestrated threads that have, some scam for, some altcoin or something like that, that's supported by, dozens of replies sometimes, kind of vindicating the person at the top. So can attest to that. You see it with the Israel and foreign policy issues too.
But it does, I will say, I have no idea exactly, but I do suspect that there are a lot of bots in my replies, because it seems like over and over again, I get replies that are they're just kind of always the same, and they don't exactly look like a person wrote them. They kind of seemed like they're like almost have like an AI generated feel to them, and there's no profile picture. I get like a lot of these now. All of a sudden, it seem like some type of bot farming. I don't know.
Pro-Israel bot farms, man, it's the way to go right now. I guess that's the way to convince people. It doesn't really take bots. You see bots figuratively in the form of people that just support unending support to Israel anyways. Put an Israeli flag in their bio as a, supposed patriotic American. Hang those flags in Congress. Lots of congressmen have them hanging there. They've actually taken some flack for that. It's an Israel first mentality, and it extends far beyond the bot farms. The bot farms are really the least of our concerns, but yeah, you do see this on social media no matter what.
I've been flooded with many tweets of people being like, well, Dave won't talk about the Druze. Oh, it's only when the state of Israel defends itself that you have a problem, but you don't have a problem with innocent Druze and Christians being killed in Syria. And then there were some people who are like actual people who were saying like a similar thing. And I don't know, it's just strange. It's like, wow, oh, so you guys actually, I mean, maybe some of them are bots, but some of them are real people. And to the real people, you guys actually just know so little about what's going on in Syria that somehow you thought this was a flex.
Yeah, no kidding. With the U.S. involved in the overthrow of Assad from the get-go, Obama wanted to launch a grand war to do that way back from the jump, and Trump escalating the war there, putting boots on the ground. Obama siding with Al-Qaeda in Syria. You have photos of John McCain meeting with Al-Qaeda fighters there, flexing with it, and we haven't learned from that. Thankfully, there's dissidents like Dave and others that know better about that, people that have covered this for a long time, Max Blumenthal, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Matte, etc.
Be like, look, Syria's falling apart. How are you going to blame that on U.S.-Israeli foreign policy? And you're like, you're not familiar, so you just don't know at all. You have no idea what you're talking about, what the situation there is. Anyway, yes, the U.S. and Israel for years was trying to overthrow the regime in Syria, and ultimately it was successful, and they ended up doing it. And now we're left in this situation that all of us were warning about. It's literally, it's almost like they say it with like no connection to the fact that like Syria has been one of our major issues for like the last 10, 15, 13 years.
Yeah, and as if there's never been any pushback about that. Even Tulsi Gabbard, as a Democratic contender for the presidential nomination, talked about this. It's what made her such a charlatan to the Democratic establishment, essentially persona non grata over that. There's been lots of opposition to this from the get-go, and it's all been a propaganda campaign to say that, hey, we have to side with Israel because of their concerns about support for Hezbollah that spills through Syria, when, well, no, you have to go as far as not only to do that, but also side with Al-Qaeda in the process, and that's what happened. Jolani actually was the current leader of Syria, by the way. He was originally a fighter in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, goes up to Syria, founds essentially the Al-Qaeda affiliate there. It's called Al-Nusra. And he's the one that the U.S. wanted to back in this regime change operation in Syria. And this whole thing just smacks of so much absurd irony, too, because it's not like, you know, them coming to Dave and saying, oh, you only care about atrocities when it's Israel that's committing them, and you don't care about the Druze like you care about innocent Palestinians. Well, they've never shown any propensity to care about defenseless Palestinians that aren't military fighters either.
There's been like one of our I mean, they do. There must be something, right? Like, isn't there some part of people who are like, okay, the non-interventionists, what do they have to say about Syria? And you'd be like, wasn't there a whole thing? Wasn't there a whole thing? The non-interventionists did used to bring up Syria a lot, right? Didn't Tulsi Gabbard go there and meet with Bashar al-Assad? And then she was smeared for trying to stop the regime change there by Hillary Clinton and the other Democrats. And then people like us were defending her. People like us were attacking Barry Weiss, who attacked her for being an Assad toady. Like, is any of this ringing a bell?
Major issue in the 2016 campaign, too. And Trump actually had some pretty good rhetoric back then about how, you know, siding with Hillary and Obama in terms of policy in Syria would lead to World War III, because it was clear Russia wanted to intervene on the side of their ally, Syria, and they ultimately did. They stopped the potential for a regime change war there. And I think that was the tipping point to make Vladimir Putin persona non grata in terms of the Washington regime forever. Those ties had been dwindling for a bit, but it wasn't that long ago that George W. Bush said, hey, I look Putin in the eye and I can tell he's an honest guy, essentially. That's paraphrasing, but that was widely broadcast. The U.S. actually did have a decent relationship with Putin in several years, and you know, just threw it away in the trash. Just let's make enemies with the power sitting on the biggest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the war over stuff like regime change in Syria on behalf of Israel, who's always wanted that regime change. It was part of the clean break strategy, part of a memo that was in the Pentagon that Wesley Clark saw when he waltzed in there 10 days after 9/11 and said, hey, I saw this memo, and Syria is one of the countries that, you know, this administration plans to overthrow in the next few years. And we know that Israel always wanted them to be overthrown too. Netanyahu specifically mentioned that in his testimony in 2002 in the drum up to the war with Iraq too.
Anyway, for people briefly, I mean, we've talked about this so many times on the show, but yeah, Syria was one of the 7 countries on Wesley Clark's list of 7 countries in 5 years to topple.
Yeah, I didn't know he was going to talk about that, but that's great.
And they didn't get there in 5 years. It took quite a bit longer, but it was under the Barack Obama administration that they started the attempted overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, even going up to Obama announcing that there would be another Iraq-style war there. And then there was major resistance from the U.S. military, and it didn't happen. But Obama was pouring money in to all of the anti-Assad rebel groups, and it became very clear very quickly that all the weapons were falling into the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that these were the anti-Assad fighters. And we would have given the country over to ISIS back then in 2012, 2013, when Obama wanted, if it wasn't for the fact that the military objected to it, and then ultimately Vladimir Putin came in to protect the Assad regime.
Absolutely. And if you remember, there's a big propaganda campaign to accompany this, as there always is in these stupid wars that don't benefit Americans whatsoever. You had all these stories that were very unsubstantiated of Assad gassing his own people. You know, the Kurds are under threat. The minorities are going to be just completely wiped out, even though that religious minorities were actually protected by Assad, no matter how monstrous that guy may have been. He did actually protect the religious minorities there. He was a relatively secular minority Sunni Shiite leader himself, actually granting some protection to Christians that live there that, oh, by the way, they're now hunting down and executing.
And so they didn't get they didn't get the regime change when they wanted it. It was also one of the things that really escalated the tensions between the U.S. Moscow or D.C. Moscow relations.
Yeah.
And it was not a coincidence that it was then a year or two later when they started framing Vladimir Putin for overthrowing our election. So these two stories are all kind of related. And Tulsi Gabbard obviously was a big figure throughout the whole, the whole push for war in Syria. And so these ISIS and Al-Qaeda guys, ultimately, after Putin came in and after Donald Trump in 2017 cut off the CIA program to back the anti-Assad rebels, and then he did some bombing campaigns on ISIS as well. But between Putin and Assad and Iran and even Donald Trump, ISIS basically receded. Their forces, they still controlled like some areas of Syria, but the civil war was put out and Assad remained in power. And then from those areas that they controlled just this past year, they came in and were able to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, it's not exactly clear, because there was some reporting on it, but it's not exactly clear what role, if any, the U.S. or Israel or Turkey or Saudi Arabia directly played when Assad was overthrown. However, let's just say there's a country and I start arming one side of the country in order to overthrow the government, and they're unable to do it. But then a few years later, they come back and they still have the arms that I gave them, and they end up overthrowing the government. I think you could still look at that as a regime change operation that ultimately was successful.
Certainly so, and I think more evidence exists than Dave is even alluding to that suggests that Erdogan and Turkey were involved in this displacement as well. It's something that Israel's wanted a long time, of course, but it's not something that's in the interest of Americans, whose enemy is not Hezbollah. It's Al-Qaeda. It should have always been Al-Qaeda. And that's despite the fact that Trump sat down with Giuliani, shook hands with him, had good diplomatic relations with him. He wouldn't do that with Iran, by the way, ultimately. And then he said he has a strong past. Well, guess what his strong past was? It was hunting down and killing American soldiers in Iraq before going to Syria and, getting involved in rebel activities there. That's what his strong past was.
I mean, so the idea that like Israel or the United States of America has no responsibility for the current situation in Syria seems goofy. That doesn't mean that the people doing the killing directly also don't have the most responsibility for it. But yes, as we've talked about many times here, it's like one of the biggest outrages in modern American foreign policy. And that is really saying something, because there's a lot of outrageous shit that the U.S. has done in the realm of foreign policy in the last couple decades. But the fact is that the emir of Al-Qaeda, Giuliani, is currently the leader of Syria. And that we're supposed to get over that. And then you had people like Ben Shapiro, right, celebrating. And don't get me wrong, he covered himself a little bit and threw in a word of caution about how this could go really bad for the Christians and the Druze there. But yes, but they were happy because, and this was really going back to the clean break strategy, going back to the 7 countries in 5 years. This was a big part of why they wanted to get rid of Syria, is they saw them as an integral ally to the Iranians, and that these were the other states in the region that were a thorn in Israel's side. And the big part, as Ben Shapiro himself laid out, and he was right about that, the big problem they had with Syria was that Iran was able to transport weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. But if you get rid of Bashar al-Assad and you put ISIS and Al-Qaeda in charge, that's going to be tougher for him.
Well, guess what? Hezbollah hasn't attacked the United States, and no matter how barbaric they are, and they are perhaps, you know, Al Qaeda is the enemy of the United States. I'm an American. I'm not going to stand for Israel's adversaries and just standing up to them in any way Israel wants, no matter what. My enemy was Al Qaeda, and that's shifted now. Al Qaeda is essentially their remnants are leading Syria, but really my true enemy is my government for standing involved in these Middle Eastern affairs that are fruitless, these entangling alliances, getting involved on the side of Al Qaeda. Just think of that. This was like 12 years after, or 11 years after 9/11, that the U.S. sides with Al Qaeda, and we're just supposed to forget that this ever happened. We're just supposed to expect that Jolani is a legitimate ruler and that this was a good thing, because Dave's right. There was a lot of adulation from the neocons and Zionists after this regime change operation was consummated at the very end of last year, end of Biden's presidency. I think it happened right before Christmas that Assad finally fled into exile in Russia. The fundamentalists took over, and you have the former Emir of Al Qaeda as the leadership role there. Now, there's lots of reporting, Jelani since left Al Qaeda, he had disputes with the leader of ISIS and stuff, but a lot of that just seems choreographed to sell this as propaganda. He's a radical Sunni insurgent that fought on the side of Al Qaeda, guys. Come on.
And so that was the calculation. Now, any normal person who's an American would look at this and right away go, well, I mean, look, Bashar al-Assad has his problems, but, he's a secular dictator in a three-piece suit who shaves his chin every morning. Like, obviously, he has historically protected the Christians and the Druze and other minority groups. And that's a lot better for stability than having fucking Al-Qaeda in there. And also, by the way, I'm an American, so Al-Qaeda is my enemy. Like a legitimate enemy of the American people.
Yeah, exactly.
And if some weapons get through from Iran to Hezbollah, well, that sure smells like it's Israel's problem and not ours. But that's not the way U.S. foreign policy works. And so we picked this situation. And now, tragically, but very predictably, it's like the Christians and the Druze are being horribly mistreated.
Exactly. Both religious minorities. The Druze make up something like 3% of the population in that country. I think the Christians are even a smaller religious minority. Both provided protections under Assad. No matter how vile or criminal or malevolent that guy was, he wasn't slaughtering these religious minorities. And for Christians in the United States to just, turn a blind eye about this and say, hey, no problem. Israel got what they wanted. It's just so stupid to justify this and to, celebrate this along with the neocons who always wanted this. USA dumped $15 billion into Syria, starting with Obama under Operation Timber Sycamore. This isn't a conspiracy. Go look that up if you don't believe me. But this had long been the goal of the United States to displace that regime, and it was accompanied by a grand war propaganda scheme. And we know that war propaganda greases the wheels of the war machine. And it was a bipartisan affair. Trump ramped it up for a time, and we still have about, I think, a fourth or a third of that territory still occupied by U.S. soldiers with the ostensible goal of, rooting out ISIS contingents that still exist, but it really is there for the sake of Israel, of course, as always.
It's terrible. So, I don't know. I was reading about it. I don't know exactly what the extent was, but there was major clashes, and I saw one report that did have, it was something in the neighborhood of like 200 civilians were straight up like just executed, like lined up, executed. That's it. So it's a horrible situation there. But again, to all these people, like, I'm sorry, but it's just, there is this weird thing where you get into debates with some of these Zionists and they start using points, and you're like, no, that's my point. That's not your point. You don't get to use my point again. It's like, anyway. And of course, Rob, as as we covered, immediately when the regime in Syria fell, Israel immediately took a big chunk of it. Then they bombed a whole bunch of their military supplies, and then they just did another bombing campaign today. And don't tell me for a second that Israel is bombing Syria out of some humanitarian desire to make sure that there's not more Druze who are killed. Like that's what motivates Israel's war policy. They just can't. The people who have inflicted the destruction of Gaza for the last 2 years are like, we just can't watch these innocent people die in Syria. That's what motivated them. I mean, come on. No, they're trying. Their goal here is to keep Syria as weak as possible and make sure that it's not a problem for them in the future. Their number one priority was to stop the weapons going into Lebanon. Now that they got that taken care of, they also realize this is a pretty unstable situation. So anyway, they want to occupy more of Syria too. That's always been part of the greater Israel project.
It certainly is, as Israel attempts to expand its West Bank settlements into parts of Lebanon and Syria. It certainly is part of the greater Israel project. But this is also very reminiscent from what happened, I think toward the end of Trump's first presidency, when there was some talk that the U.S. might withdraw all of its forces from Syria. There was some indication Trump entertained that for a time. We know he was lied to about some of his top brass and top generals, and Mike Pompeo, by the way, that swamp creature that planned the assassination of Julian Assange. That guy tried to convince Trump to keep the troops there. Why? Because Israel and the neocons, brought up this new propaganda scheme. What about the Kurds? What will happen to them? If we leave the Kurds, they're just going to get massacred by Assad and his regime. This group of Kurds that Americans hadn't even heard the name of since the time of the Iraq War, because many of the Iraq religious minorities, the Kurds, lived in northern Iraq. They hadn't even heard that term, but now we're supposed to care about, just shelving American foreign policy goals that are good, that is minding our own business, for the sake of this people that you had never heard of, that no one was, assumed to have heard of before, until there was this war propaganda purpose to keep troops there, keep the possibility of displacing Assad alive. And that's ultimately what happened. It wasn't just the U.S. that caused it. It was Israel and Turkey and some other forces too. But Dave's right. This whole thing is absurd. And for the neocons to talk about, hey, this is problematic for the non-interventionists, is crazy. It's because of the interventionists that there are slaughters of Christians and Druze now in Syria. And guess what my answer to that is? It's not military intervention. It's to get out of the Middle East for good. This is a constant cycle of violence that accompanies the U.S. and its relationship with Israel in the Middle East. I don't think it will abate until the U.S. gets out of it. So yeah, I'm with Dave here. This regime change operation was absurd and treasonous, because if you look at the Constitution, Article 3, Section 3 says that treason shall consist of levying war against the states, in the plural, by the way, because we are supposed to be a federal republic and not a nation, but that's besides the point, or aiding or adhering to their enemies. That's exactly what this policy was from the Obama presidency forward, when the rebel groups in Syria were armed, and those arms did trickle down to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was the enemy of the United States, right? Right? You guys didn't miss that, right? That's what we heard, and that's what the answer was, because Al-Qaeda, had 9/11. Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11, but not just that. They bombed the USS Cole. They bombed the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And the first World Trade Center attack was the work of Al-Qaeda as well in 1993. So they were the United States' enemy, not Hezbollah. And hey, I don't want terrorism to occur all around the world in any place, but it's not the U.S. responsibility to try to stifle that. Hezbollah is Israel's problem. It's not the United States' problem. Hezbollah didn't attack the United States. Al-Qaeda did. And that's what Americans are losing the grasp of when you have these neocons just planning and plotting regime change operations in all sorts of countries, and will sell it in any way they possibly can, regardless of what the truth is regarding America's enemies. The true enemy class is the ruling class. That's what we know now from viewing politics, and especially through the foreign policy lens the last few years. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below, is Dave right about why Syria is such a catastrophe right now? Are the neocons just going to keep digging in on trying to rake the non-interventionists over the coals on this, despite the fact it was them that elevated Jolani? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Dave Smith too. He's awesome. Great coverage of the Syria issue here. Please consider becoming a YouTube member if you click the join button below. You can help the channel and you can get access to all my videos before they go live. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.